All right, everybody, I think we're going to get started here if you can get settled in. I'm David Eaton. I'm one of the nurse practitioners at Seattle Children's Autism Center. I'm, whoa, there you go. We'll turn that down later. Hosting Autism 200 tonight, the first of the year. As we've done in previous years, we're going to kick it off with the State of Autism in 2017. We have Jim and Raphe doing that tonight in their what has now become a routine format of a newscast. So I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones. With the kind of way that we're doing Autism 200 tonight, we're going to do it just holding questions until the end of the presentation. Jim and Raphe have assured everybody that they'll be available for autographs. They want me to emphasize that later. Also pictures, it says here. So Jim and Raphe, come on down.
Okay, I think we're ready to start. Good evening. Welcome to the State of Autism in 2017. I'm Jim Mancini.
And I'm Raphael Bernier.
Tonight we are here to talk about all the developments in research community over the last year, and really to kind of talk a little bit about what we might be able to expect in the coming year. Okay, so clearly the most impressive, the most amazing development in autism worldwide last year was the launching of the Autism Blogcast with Jim and Raphe. Thank you. Thank you. So we release the blog every month through the Autism blog, and so make sure to sign up and take a look at what we do every month, and we talk about research developments, and we talk about different things in the community. Right?
Exactly. Thanks, Jim. So, all that kidding aside, let's move to some of the key findings from science in 2016, and we're going to start in the area of genetics. Now, one of the biggest advances in 2016 really stems from the unveiling or the rolling out of the largest study of autism that's ever been conducted. It's called the SPARK study. And now it's a study that's been funded and supported by the Simons Foundation. And what the goal is of the SPARK study is to engage 50,000 families in a project around genetics in terms of gene discovery, as well as setting the stage for precision medicine. And the focus of the study, we aim to do that by first engaging families, collecting information, both on the genetic level and then at some basic behavior level, with the idea that families would be interested in being contacted in the future. So what the study will be about is working with families, conducting what's called exome sequencing. Exome sequencing is the sequencing of all the gene coding regions of the genome. And this can be done by collecting a bit of saliva. And you can scan through all those gene coding regions, identify genes that have been either disrupted, or genes that are not creating the proteins they're supposed to create, or we find genes that have variations that are just very rare or unusual. We're not quite exactly sure what they do, but they happen in that variation happens so infrequently we think, it might be playing a role. And so what we're doing is we're scanning through the gene coding regions of all these genomes for all these individuals and looking at genes that we know have already been implicated in autism. At that point, we then inform families of what that particular event is, and we say, in the future, would you like to be contacted about future studies that are specific to your child? Because then what we can do is, as we develop treatments that are specific to a given particular genetic variant or genetic event, we can then invite families to participate in a study that's targeted toward their family or their child. Really the idea that precision medicine, we can develop treatments that are specific to a given individual based on their biology. So that's what the focus or the goal of the SPARK study is. It's just rolling out. It started in April nationwide. We started here in Seattle a little bit earlier because we because we're driving this show. But then we roped in 22 other places around the country, and already since April, we've got over 20,000 individuals with autism that have enrolled for this study. So really aiming to shoot that goal, hit that goal of 50,000 families. And that's important. I swear I'll stop talking in a second, Jim. That's important because of all the genetic events we've identified, and we've done pretty well, right? So we've been able to identify in about half of all individuals who have autism, we can actually pinpoint what particular gene is functioning differently, so to speak. And we know that now, but each one of those particular events is very different. There's about 1,000 different genetic events that we've identified that we believe are playing a causal or contributory role. So you might imagine, in order to find enough individuals who have the same type of event, you need large numbers of people, because each of those particular events is individually rare. That was a mouthful, Jim. And that was what happened in 2016. But let me take a second and say what's happening, what can we think about coming up in the next year? And I'm going to start by highlighting some research that will be coming out in early January. Not in early January, in early 2017, probably February. What we can anticipate in 2017 is more identification of genes that we know are playing a causal role in autism. This is a complicated slide, and it's supposed to be because a geneticist made it, and that's how it works when you're a geneticist, but I'm going to walk us through this complicated slide and tell you a little about what the study, what will be happening in this study that was conducted by some really brilliant scientists, I might add. So what the scientists did was they applied a new type of genetic sequencing technology, an approach where you can sequence and identify how a gene is functioning at a very cheap, sort of efficient way. It doesn't cost a ton of money. And you can sequence a large number of genes and a large number of individuals and find out how is that gene functioning. Is it creating the protein it's supposed to be creating? Or is it creating something that we're not sure exactly what it does? It's kind of an unusual variant. And so by using this new technology, it's called MIP sequencing, these great scientists sequenced 14,000 families with autism and started to identify, well, first thing is they confirmed that many of the genes we know that have already played a causal role, that they in fact are. We found a lot of support say, boom, we are really now much more confident these genes are playing a contributory role, as well as identified a number of new genes that are playing a role. So what this complicated slide, I'm just going to talk us through real briefly. What this slide shows is two different sort of lines, a red line and a blue line. And what these are all just individual genes that have been identified that now we know are playing a contributory causal role in autism. In red, these are genes that have been, they're called likely gene disrupting mutations. What happens is these genes are not creating the protein that they're supposed to create. There's basically a disruption to the sequencing, and it prevents that gene from creating the protein. It stops the coding of that protein. The blue line are types of variants called a missense variants, where the gene still creates a protein. We just don't exactly know what that protein does because it's an unusual protein. It's not sort of formed in the same way we would anticipate what that protein is supposed to look like. And so what we can see, what we can't see on this slide, but we imagine we could see if we were a crazy geneticist looking at a complicated slide in a journal article, as you can see, we identified a number of genes. So this particular study identified 32 new genes that are playing a contributory role. Our estimate is 822 different genes and another couple hundred genetic variants and gene events that are contributing to autism. About 1,000 different things contributing to autism. And we get able to pinpoint what many of these likely gene disrupting events are and many of these missense events. And so this is just a close-up. As we get closer and closer, you can see there's many, many, many genes in this list, so we're just doing a closer look. So what all this means, because I'm pretty excited about this new study coming out. What this study means is it really highlights that by identifying more and more genetic events, we are starting to understand more and more closely what those genes do, what kind of proteins they create, and that starts to give us ideas for how we can intervene to address that particular protein. There are particular compounds that can change or improve functioning of that protein, or there are particular compounds and medications that can basically compensate for what that protein is not doing. So I just want to say one more thing about the study, Jim, and then I'm going to move right along, is that that's not all these amazing scientists did. In addition to identifying and confirming a number of these genetic events, they also started to find how these different gene events were hanging together. And what they're able to do is start to see that some of these genes really tended to focus on individuals, or tend to only be found in individuals who had autism and intellectual disability, and many of these genes that only were identified in individuals who had autism but did not have intellectual disability. So we start to see a little divergence there in the way genes are contributing to different aspects of neural function, the way the brain functions. But again, that's not all these amazing scientists did. The final thing they did was they also started to look at what are the patterns of behaviors that are associated with each of these different particular types of genes. So, for example, in looking at a number of individuals who had a particular disruption at this gene CHD2, we could start to figure out, well, what is the pattern of behaviors, the profile of an individual with autism with that particular gene event? And you start to see particular patterns, different subgroups that develop. And the reason that's important is because we know, we've all heard the phrase, autism is a heterogeneous disorder. If you met one child with autism, you met one child with autism, and now we can start to understand kind of why that is. Really sort of providing support for the evidence that these are really distinct, separate, different sets of challenges that we all call autism. So on that note, I'm going to move away from science for a second, Jim. What do you think?
Sure.
Okay.
I do have a question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So does this help us kind of think about this idea of, many different types of like autisms, a plural? Is that something that this might be able to kind of help us understand?
I think it's exactly how we start to think about this, is that all of these different gene events, we start to see different patterns of behavior, and really the notion of an autism probably makes more sense than autism. Yeah.
All right. So, I saw on our way in that there was a desk out there that was, for the study that we talked about.
Spark study.
Spark study.
Yeah, good
so,
point.
if you're interested in getting more information about the Spark study, go talk to Emily on the way out.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So, 2016 saw some nice developments, both locally and nationally. In Washington last year, the Governor Inslee signed a bill that funded parent-to-parent programs across the state. And really parent-to-parent is, kind of demonstrates exactly what most of us knew all along. Most of us who work with families who have kids with autism, is that the best place to learn about autism is from other parents, other people who have kind of lived that life, have walked that walk for a while. And really what parent-to-parent does is it provides a connection with people who have some experience and who are able to mentor new families who are just getting a diagnosis. So this is a really exciting program. The ARC of Washington State is a great place to, and we're going to be talking about the ARC more as we go on. And really what we think of parent-to-parent is one more aspect of the comprehensive community health programs that we want to set up that is going to be kind of more comprehensive in nature. Another development last year, and this is a busy little slide as well, is some nice news from the Developmental Disability Administration, DDA. Last year, we saw more families receiving funds from DDA than we had seen in the last 12 years, I think. And what this kind of shows you, is this the top one here?
The top one.
All right. So, this actually is a graph that comes from August. And this chart right here is beginning to say, well, how many families are taking advantage of what's called the Individual and Family Service Waiver. And what's cool about the IFS waiver is that families can take advantage and use these funds to pay for therapies. You can pay for materials, you can pay for training. There's lots of great things that families can use this money. Social skills groups, we saw the group from Aspiring Youth outside. They are contracted with DDA, so that would be something that you might be able to use your funds for. And when we contacted DDA this week, we received word that at this time there's no wait list to receive these services. And we're here in, where is it? January of 2017. And they are meeting these sort of benchmarks. So they've got about 4,500 to 4,800 families signed up. The goal is for them to have 6,500 by June of 2017, and I believe that is where they're going to cap it. So the kind of take-home message here is there are funds available for families. It is definitely worthwhile to contact DDA as soon as you can and see if you can take advantage of these funds that are available. And then finally this year, at the end of the year, Congress passed and President Obama signed the 21st Century Cures Act that some mental health advocates in our country have said is the most significant mental health legislation since 2008. So that's 9 years. It definitely has its critics, and some of the critics are saying that the law is more tailored towards supporting the pharmaceutical industry and much more focused on development of medications. However, there are some really important provisions in this law that will provide support for families, including a mandate to federal agencies to provide evidence-based practices and a focus on intervention early when mental health issues arise, right? Lots of times it's more of this failure model, and we're going to wait until, you know, we're in a desperate situation. What this act has, you know, kind of mandates is that we're going to try to act early. What it also provides is 24-hour support for families who are identified as having these issues. That's it. I'm ready for you.
That's great. Thanks, Jim. Great. Well, let's switch back over to science for a moment. A study was released this past fall that got quite a bit of national press. The study focused on autism symptoms and their relationship to genetic variations and exposure to ultrasound in the first trimester. Here this evening with us is the lead author on this study, Dr. Sarah Webb. If you could join me up front here, Dr. Webb. Thank you for coming down.
Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent. Excellent.
I'm sorry, you guys. Do you mind if I interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
Did I see that Dr. Raphael Bernier is an author on this study?
Yes, Jim.
Is that,
Thanks,
am I
Jim.
reading that right, Sarah?
Not this one.
No.
Totally different person.
I just love him. Don't you love him?
I've got some stories to
Okay,
tell,
good.
so we'll get to those in the question and answer
sorry
period.
to interrupt. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. So thank you for joining us here, Dr. Webb. We
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that. So your study got quite a bit of press this past fall. Just tell us a little bit about what you did in that study.
Yeah, so there's been a big question. We talked, or Raphe, you've spoken a little bit about genetic contributions to autism, but we know that that doesn't really explain the full story of how children with autism, even when they have the same genetic events, turn out to be very different from each other. And so we took a perspective of looking at genes, the environment, and the interaction between the two of them. So specifically, we investigated a hypothesis about how autism variability occurs. Why are children who have the same disorder so different from each other? And the idea is that if you have a stressor, an environmental stressor that occurs during a particularly vulnerable period of development, and that's what we looked at was the first trimester of development, and that happens in a group of kids that have a genetic, underlying genetic predisposition to having disrupted brain development. And then what happens and can that account for the variability we see in children?
Yeah, interesting. And so, well, what happened? What'd you
So
find?
I met this guy named Raphe. No, so we came together with a bunch of different investigators from very different disciplines. So we had individuals who have a background in working in ultrasound technology, those like you and I who work in brain development and genetics, clinicians, epidemiologists. And we posed this hypothesis and went and worked with a set of data on children that had already been collected. So we had 1,700 children who had data both on that they had autism, that they had known information about their genetic background, and we also knew whether or not they had received an ultrasound in the first trimester, the second or third, or any time during pregnancy. And what we were able to do by looking at those combination of things is that when we looked at specifically those children with autism who had these genetic errors, and who also received a first trimester ultrasound compared to children with those same backgrounds who had autism and a genetic error who didn't receive a first trimester ultrasound. We found that those kids with the ultrasound actually scored worse on IQ tests. They had lower nonverbal scores, and they were more likely to have higher levels of repetitive behaviors and other autism symptoms. So in our analysis, it seemed that again, this was putting additional stress on the fetus during this really early point of development. And this does follow for some work that you had done and others looking at other types of environmental stressors that, you know, you had looked at the role maternal infections during pregnancy had played. Others have looked at other environmental exposures like air pollution, and exposure to certain types of medications during pregnancy. So there seems that there could be a host of things in our environment that are particularly stressful to vulnerable in very early very early development. And we really propose that we have to look at that first trimester when the brain is really forming its initial blueprints of how it's going to grow and develop.
Gotcha. So given that, what are the implications? What does that mean?
So what does it mean? Yeah. And this has been, you know, when you come up with something like this, and I'm sure many of you have seen sensational headlines. So how do we really make an interpretation of this? I'd like to stress that there's two additional points that we came out of this. Is that when we looked at ultrasound any other time during pregnancy, it didn't have any adverse effects at all. And actually, it shows some good effects, potentially signifying that moms were getting good care, right? Because it means you're in ultrasound, you have a doctor who's watching out and looking out for you during that time. And so I think that what we need to think about again is that there are things that we can be exposed to that we have control over, right? We can change whether or not we have an ultrasound during pregnancy, and particularly with some of the new monitoring techniques to look at early development of the fetus. We can do other things other than ultrasound. And so we can make those choices. Some things we can't. Some environmental stressors we don't have a lot of choice about being exposed to. So I think it poses, opens up that conversation again for going for women and families when going in and talking with an obstetrician about what their risk is, what the techniques that are being used to really monitor their pregnancy, and making decisions that are really guided by what is needed to change clinical care. And I've been very open. I had 2 kids. I had ultrasounds during my pregnancy. I had ultrasounds during the first trimester with both of my pregnancies. And in my first pregnancy, a firstborn male, which is a risk, those are 2 risk factors for autism to themselves, they were medically necessary. They actually changed my care. And those were really important that we talked about it with my doctor, is that the information was going to change the way that we looked at that pregnancy. And in my second one, it was for fun. I mean, in some ways it was. It was, oh, you happen to be pregnant and you know you've been waiting, and let's see. And I think that's a time when we need to think about it. We also know there's been an explosion of using ultrasound for take-home pictures. You know, there have been, basically ultrasound photography studios that have opened up, and you can get an over-the-counter ultrasound machine too to take home. A friend told me about someone that brought them home, and they were doing ultrasounds every week and those types of things. So I think we have to think about our caution about using. I mean, we could say medical technology, but I think a lot of things that, we casually incorporate technology into our environment. In some cases, it really can make our lives better, and other times I think we need to know a little bit more about it. So it's just another thing for people to think about during pregnancy and as they're getting pregnancy. But I think the bigger scientific issue is that it really pushes our field to say, it is important to know what genetic events are contributing to development, but it's also important for us to think about how these interact with the environment and be sensitive to both these potentially very complex contributing factors to how kids develop in good ways and I think in difficult ways, putting stress on the situation.
Helpful. And I know that you'll be here for a little while to answer other questions as well, so that's great. So I have 2 more quick questions since I have the microphone now. I can ask them. So one is, tell us a little about what it was like to work with the press.
The press?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a lot of press around this last fall.
There has been a lot of press around this, and it was actually, being in Seattle, exceptionally wonderful. I would have to say our local TV stations did a really fantastic job of taking the time. Their science the people that they were working with read the paper. They came in with a lot of great questions. They worked with us a lot, basically really prepped to understand all the nuances. And I think they were very careful about, how to put that out. The other one that was really great was NPR as well. The National Public Radio station, the local KUOW came in and did it, and then it got broadcast more. But again, did the same thing, really put someone that wanted to spend the time and think about the science and ask questions and then work through us with a way, again, to deliver a message, make sure that it's out there for people to, have their own decisions, but also to put the caveats on it that we want when we try to communicate scientific messages.
Right. It's complicated. Science is complicated.
It's never as straightforward, and as you know, there's lots of ways that things can be exaggerated and changed, but we also do, really believe in communicating a message and putting that out there for people, not only families to really think about some of these issues, but for other scientists as well, because a lot of the we behind the scenes, which many people don't see, is we got a lot of response from colleagues being, hey, what if we did this? Can we look at this? What if we used another data set? Have you considered doing this? Hey, I have another model. So I think it drives both the communication with the families and communication with other scientists.
Right. Cool. In the interest of time, we should probably move on. I would love to know at some point about what it was like to work with those amazing co-authors there.
Yeah, there are some good people here in Seattle.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. Great.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ABA. Last year we saw some nice progress in regards to ABA in our state, and we have a lot to kind of look forward to this year. One thing that we saw was that we saw an increase in ABA coverage by insurances. Specifically, federally funded plans are now covering ABA therapy. Really the only outlier, the last kind of sort of mountain to climb here is what's called the self-funded plans. So those are those plans that are money is put into by the business that is usually a bigger business. So like Seattle Children's Hospital, has a self-funded plan, and self-funded plans are allowed to kind of make decisions about what type of what they offer in terms of therapies, in terms of their programs. So, I was communicating with Arzu Farrow this week from WA, and what she said was that she encourages families, if you're on a self-funded plan and those plans are still holding out and not providing ABA therapy, it's definitely worthwhile to contact them and to really question when are we going to do this, and talk to their human resources companies, departments. And another thing that we saw was a very large increase in intensive early intervention ABA programs in our state this year. Just 3 years ago, we only had 2 of these in the state, and now we have 15. And more to come, over this year. Of note, we will be having our own Dr. Mendy Minhares, who's the director of our own intervention program here. She'll be coming to speak in October at the Autism 200 presentation, and to provide some information about, well, what did we have to do in order to get this set up, okay? Looking forward to 2017, this summer we expect the Washington Department of Health to finalize the rules around licensure for board certified behavior analysts, or BCBAs as we call them. Up to this point, there have been no rules that regulate who puts a sign up outside their office and says, oh, I can do behavioral therapy, I'm an ABA therapist. So this is a good thing for our state to have some regulation, some certification, a license for ABA therapists to practice. One thing that it will provide is that we should be able to have more BCBAs charge insurance. So that should improve access to families, that and there alone. BCBAs as well as the behavior technicians, so the people who come to the house and do the majority of the direct work with the kids, who are kind of under the BCBA. They're both going to be licensed, and they're going to be there's going to be sort of minimal standards that they're going to need to be able to demonstrate in order to be able to practice. They will be required to have continuing education, just like teachers and speech therapists and occupational therapists and psychologists. Everybody, doctors, we all need to go do continuing ed, and we want that those practitioners to go out there and continue to learn what's the most recent information. And really, this will also open up the opportunity for families to get information about these people. So since they're going to be registered through the state, you can contact the Department of Health and say, tell me a little bit about this person that I just hired to work with my child. And that's really good information. So it provides us all, we're going to be better consumers, and we're going to have higher quality of care and hopefully more access to the broad population who still is hard to get into ABA Even here in King County, where we've got seemingly tons of them. There's a factory of ABA therapists coming from the Washington, UW, it seems like. So, so lots to look forward to this year in regards to access to ABA.
That's great.
Right?
That's great. Well, I'm going to talk a little about some research, jumping back to research that doesn't come from that factory. Factory. I never thought of it as a factory.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good factory. It's a well-designed factory.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So, thinking about other science, in 2016, one of the key papers that came out was published in Cell. And what the folks did, the scientists did, again, which had nothing to do with the University of Washington. I just want to clarify, Jim.
Okay.
So I was not involved with this project. So what the scientists did in this particular study was they were really curious about what is it about sensory sensitivities that might be playing a role in autism? Can we make some sense of that? Can we understand some of the sensitivities that not all kids with autism show, but that many kids with autism demonstrate, or individuals demonstrate? And it's a very interesting study. What they did was they started working with the MECP2 mouse. Now, MECP2 is a gene that is responsible for Rett syndrome. And individuals with Rett syndrome shows a number of characteristic social deficits, very similar to autism, as well as presence of some other behaviors, some repetitive behaviors, some regression and decline in ability and such, a number of medical problems. And so what they did is they took the MECP2 mouse, which is a mouse where you can recapitulate many of those symptoms that we see in humans. We see them in mice. We see, again, repetitive behaviors. We see some of those social deficits in mice. We don't. The social deficits are things like caring for offspring, making nests for offspring, how much you sniff and interact with another mouse. And what they did is they took MECP2 mouses and they knocked out the presence of that gene for some of those mice where the gene was expressed in the brain, but the MECP2, that gene was expressed everywhere else in the body. They also took then and they knocked out the MECP2 gene in all the peripheral nervous systems. So those are basically that part of your nervous system that's not based in your brain, where a lot of our sensation comes from. And what it is, and they looked at the behaviors in these mice that either had that gene knockout only in the brain or only in their peripheral nervous system. What they found was that the mice that had the gene knockout in the brain, they showed many of the characteristic impairments we see in Rett syndrome, the social deficit, some of the repetitive behaviors, some of the other complications. The mice that had the knockout only in the peripheral nervous system, they showed predominantly a hypersensitivity to touch, a lot of tactile hypersensitivity, and the social deficits. We did not see those in the MECP2 mice that had just the knockout in just the brain. So the scientists thought, okay, that's sort of interesting. Let's sort of make sense of that. They then went and said, well, let's try this somewhere else. And I'm going to make a hunch that it was the reviewers that asked them to do this and make sure they did this. They went and found a different mouse model for autism that disrupts a GABAergic functioning gene. And they did the same exact model where they knocked out this particular gene in the brain for some group of mice, and then only in the peripheral nervous system for other mice, on the exact same pattern. So what does this mean? What are the implications? Well, what these scientists are suggesting is that really that sensory sensitivity, that hypersensitivity, may be part and parcel of what's going on in terms of some of the social challenges we see in autism. It sort of makes sense at some level, right? We might imagine, well, if you're struggling with processing sensory information around you, then it's going to be pretty hard to interact and engage in a social way. The follow-up study that they did, these scientists did, was they looked at this in adult mice and a child mouse. I don't know how you pronounce it. Anyway, young mice. And in the adult mice, where you still see that hypersensitivity of the sensory system for those with a knockout in the peripheral nervous system, you don't see the social impairments. It's only when that hypersensitivity happens early on in development, and then we see the social challenges develop. So this is just one study. Would I say, wow, I think all of the social challenges that we see in autism are caused by a sensory sensitivity? I'm not going to hang my hat on that, but I do think it's a very interesting and important finding in thinking about how a gene is disrupted really depends on where it's disrupted in the body, right? Genes can be expressed in various parts of the body, and thinking about that is a really important new contribution to autism. Great. Okay, enough of science. We'll science break now.
Okay. So, we've heard a lot this past year about government dysfunction in Washington, D.C., and well, we have our own government dysfunction in our own Washington as well. And it really revolves around funding for basic education. You know, everybody have been hearing about this in the news. It kind of got a lot of press over the last couple of weeks. And you know, one of the things that keeps getting brought up is something called the McCleary decision. So we're going to go talk, just to give you a little brief background on McCleary, which was filed all the way back in 2007. Decision was made in 2010, and in 2012, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the state of Washington was violating the constitutional rights of children, and by failing to live up to its paramount duty to amply fund education for all students K through 12. So the court ordered the legislature to make steady and real and measurable progress each year and to fully fund K through 12 public education by 2018, which back in 2009 didn't seem like it was that long, but now this is next year. So these requirements included all children, including children with disabilities. In 2014, the state Supreme Court ruled the legislature was in contempt for failing to obey the court order and began fining the legislature $100,000 per day for not filing a report related to the progress that had been made towards reaching this goal. Last fall, the Supreme Court ruled that the legislature continues to not meet the expectations and are clearly not making real and measurable progress. The court clarified that the deadline for fully funding K through 12 basic education is September 1st, 2018. Since then, the state legislature has not been able to agree about how to fully fund education for Washington State students. This is a really complex issue, and I think it has a very complex solution. And luckily, we have someone here who knows a lot more about it than I do. To gain more information about the McCleary decision and the issues facing this year, we have Ramona Hattendorf, who's the advocacy director from the ARC of King County. She's going to be here. Tell us a little bit more. Thanks, Ramona. How are you? Okay, thanks for coming out. So yeah, just hit that up. Okay. So, you know, could you give us just a little more information about McCleary and you know, kind of catch us up to where we are right now?
Okay. All right. So first of all, you can't take McCleary away from basic education. The components are all kind of tied together. And with McCleary, it's really, a lot of people think it's about money, and it is about money, but more fundamentally, it's about opportunity and what we're doing with opportunity. So when McCleary was filed, it was 2007, and what a lot of local districts were providing as basic for what people commonly thought was a normal, typical education was actually a lot more than what the state was providing. The state was providing basic down here, and then locally, the districts who could afford to were providing something up here, and there was a gap. And so people sued, because not all districts could provide the high level, and there was just a lot of inequity funding-wise. So people sued, and that was 2007. Well, by 2009, the state legislature redefined this idea of basic education. And basically, it's a long thing. It has opportunity in there 2 or 3 times. It has meaningful in there. But basically, what they redefined basic education is all children would have the opportunity to acquire the skills needed to have the opportunity, again, basically to earn a meaningful diploma. And they define that as a diploma that prepared all children for post-secondary study, gainful employment, and citizenship. So you had this concept of opportunity now. So that was in 2009. And then by the time the Supreme Court finally decided in 2012, the state was arguing, look, we've got this great new program of basic education coming out. We're really elevating. We're doing all this wonderful stuff. And the court basically said, okay, you guys are way out of, it's not paramount. It's not even adequate, let alone ample, so you lose. But if you actually fund and implement that, then we're okay. And so that's what they're trying to do now. So the state went ahead and was trying to finish phasing in this reform they passed in 2009. So that's where we are with opportunity. So why is this so difficult? Okay, money, and what is opportunity? So we're talking about a lot more money. I mean, billions of more money. So where do you get that? And so we're really at an impasse now. It's like they gradually brought it up, and now we're just right back at the question of revenue. And there's a lot of people who do not agree about revenue or is it cuts? And this has just been this dance the legislator has been in for decades. So you still have this continual dance. And on top of that, they can't decide what the price tag is. They can't even decide who gets to decide what the price tag is. It's like one of the examples is that the state will set a salary for teachers, say this is what teachers should make. But then at the local level, they actually negotiate their salaries. So you just, it's dysfunctional. And so you have this problem of revenue. The other problem, and what's the word I want? Well, anyways, the other thing that's holding everything up is the concept going back to opportunity. What does that mean? What does it mean? It brings in the concepts of equity and equality and access. It could possibly be really exciting in bringing concepts of inclusion, but they can't, turns out there's a lot of disagreement about what is opportunity and what does it mean for different students. So there's been a lot of bills and a lot of argument and a lot of back and forth about the concept of opportunity. So that's where we are. We're stuck about the question of money, and we're stuck over the question of, well, what does opportunity mean?
So, and how does, a lot of our kids who have autism receive special education services.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does this discussion, this impasse, impact children receiving special ed? Is there a discussion going on about how to serve this population?
So hopefully you all know that special educations are also, they're all, first and foremost, they're general education, which means they're also basic education. And in the Constitution, they talk about all children. And when they define basic education, again, they said all children have an opportunity. So you're part of this conversation. Everyone's part of this conversation. All is all. In regards to special education, there could be an opening to really, if we do it well, if we really fund this the right way, there could be an opening that's really beautiful. Because again, you're looking at that concept of equity and you're looking at the concept of opportunity. So if they were to fund, really look at the support that students need. If they can make sure, the therapies are there, they can make sure your counselors are there, your family engagement people are there. If they could really look at sort of like the whole child and really look at the whole child funding of what's needed, that would be really good. That would be awesome. One of the things right now, though, is the conversation is really getting bogged down into just class size and salaries. And those are important conversations, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more to discuss. And so that's where we want to make sure. You could just decide it's going to be about class size and teacher salary, or you could open the door to this wider support system.
And one thing that we seem to be hearing over and over this year is this 12.7% rule. Yeah. So can you explain a little bit about that is and sort of some of the fundamental problems with that?
Okay. So the 12.7 is the state at some point, and I actually asked Chris Reichtel, who actually is now the state superintendent, when we met with him when he was running, I'm like, why do we have this 12.7? And he's like, yeah, I don't know. I guess it sounded good to somebody at some point. So what we have is for special education funding, you have 12.7%, and that 12.7%, and that's the cap. So a district will get 12.7 funds for the kids. They just make this assumption that you have 12.7% of students in your school who require special education services. But some school districts have more than that. And if you're a large school district like Seattle, you can kind of, parse out and you can kind of even it all out. But if you're a small school district and you get even a few more kids, then what happens if you go above that 12.7, that's where you have to turn to your local funds, and that's where you have to check in your levies, or that's when you have to take one pool or move to another pool, or that's when you start thinking, well, we can't let all these kids have special education services, and that's when you start to see services denied.
Okay, so, we have a lot of parents, we also have school personnel who are here, what can they do to help advocate for, funding this basic education?
I've been thinking a lot about this, and I honestly think one of the most important things that a parent of a child who takes any sort of special education or any sort of complex needs really needs to be able to speak to disability awareness. You can't stay in a contained world. You really have to make sure that all parents understand why this is so important, and that all school personnel understand why this is important. Because really the solution going forward is really taking a whole child approach and really having a universal designed education that's accessible to all kids. And there's an opening because there's a lot of conversation now about whole child, but they're thinking more in terms of kids who've gone through trauma. And if you can just ask them to please broaden that to include the other kids, all kids, there's potential here. But you really have to make the case. It's like out of sight, out of mind.
So where can families keep up to date regarding, what's happening, what's happening in, in Olympia, and, kind of just keeping track to have, just to be aware of what's happening?
Yeah. Well, at the ARC of King County, I'll be doing weekly legislative updates, and we have a blog. You can check there. And then also the ARC of Washington they also have advocacy news, and we have action alerts. And then the ARC nationally also has. And the ARC national will be more about where you get information about, ESSA and IDEA and things like that. But locally, once a week, I'm filing it. Just today we have paraeducator bill, which could be awesome. And on Monday we have a beautiful bill that would make it outlaw to expel or suspend a kindergartner or first or second grader. So there is progress.
Yes.
There's a door. There's a small opening.
Yeah. So when we hear about these bills, this is where we want to call and say, hey, I support that bill.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So, well, thank you, Ramona. Here's some information about the ARC of King County, and hopefully you'll be around later to answer some questions.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So we chatted a little bit about some advances in science of autism in terms of causes and thinking about what might be happening in the brain, the nervous system. We also had a couple of landmark studies that came out this past year focused on treatment, specifically around parent training and parent-mediated treatment. We happen to have a resident expert in parent-mediated treatments here in Seattle, and actually author of one of those hallmark studies. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Karen Barris to come on down and chat with us, if you may.
And Karen's new to Seattle, so you should find her later and ask her what she thinks.
Exactly. Thank you, Dr. Barris, for joining us. Thank you. Excellent. So there were a couple studies that came out this past year, and the first study I wanted to ask you about was about Dr. Pickles' outcome study, where he focused on parent-mediated social communication therapy. And can you even unpack that phrase for us?
Interventionists like to come up with really fun names for our new treatments. So yes, so this article is about a parent-mediated social communication therapy. And what I want to start by doing is actually highlighting the parent-mediated part.
Okay.
When we think about interventions for kids with ASD and kind of the history of treatments, we oftentimes think of services that involve a therapist working with the child. And what's really exciting is there's been this expanded interest in involving parents in treatment and actually helping them to become the agent of change or the therapist for their child. And there's several treatments that are kind of emerging that are taking this kind of parent-mediated approach, and this happens to be one of them. It's a parent-mediated intervention. And this one in particular is focused on enhancing social communication in children with ASD. And so the parents are taught the skills to work with their child to help things like improving the child's social initiations, their response, or their social responsiveness, as well as important verbal and nonverbal communication skills. So
great. So what did they find?
Yes.
Give us the answer.
So there's actually a very cool story to this particular study, because it's a follow-up study published in 2016 of a paper that initially came out in 2010, which was the initial kind of study of the PACT intervention in kids with ASD. And this was a study that had 152 families participating, which is huge and awesome. I really like big N studies. You don't always see them in intervention studies for autism, so this is a big deal that 152 families were involved. And they were randomized to either the PACT treatment or treatment as usual, so whatever they were getting in the community. The PACT treatment was an intervention that was 2 hours every other week for 6 months,
and then monthly follow-up for an additional 6 months. So it was 1 year in total of treatment, but about 18 sessions of intervention. So it's actually a pretty low-intensity intervention when you think about autism services. And so they found some really cool things, which is that in looking at the interactions between the parent and child, that there was this lovely improvement in parent-child synchrony, so kind of responsiveness to one another, and child initiations improved. But when they looked at their primary outcome, which is improvements in autism severity, they didn't find anything. And so this is actually a little disappointing, especially when you think about big study, big money put into it, that their primary outcome that they were hoping to see change in didn't happen. And actually interesting, at the very bottom of the conclusions of the study in 2010, they actually said they did not recommend PACT as an intervention for kids with ASD, which is a bold statement. So we could have, or they could have left things as is, but Dr. Pickles, which again is a phenomenal name, wanted to see, you know, what happened with these kids down the road. And so he actually followed up these families 6 years after they participated in the study, which again, huge. I mean, when we think about long-term studies, it's usually, you know, 6 months later, 3 months later. So the fact that they're following these families 6 months after they, or 6 years, I'm sorry, after they participated in this treatment is a really huge deal. And what they found, or what he found and his colleagues found, is at the 6-year mark, there actually were differences between the PACT families and the treatment as usual families in terms of autism severity. So the kids in PACT 6 years later actually had improved or had reductions in their autism severity. So this is kind of a cool finding. And actually, when they also looked at autism a little bit differently and went back to their data after the 12-month study, that they also saw some signals of change in autism severity when they looked at it in a little bit of a different way. Yeah. So I think the cool thing about the study is it's essentially saying that when we look at these interventions, they're doing a lot of great things in terms of just changing those moment-to-moment daily interactions between the parent and the child. But it also looks like there may be kind of a longer-term, kind of down the road, call it maybe a sleeper effect in terms of actually ultimately improving autism symptomatology in these kids, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. So, well, given the earlier paper's recommendation at the end, and now this later finding, what are the implications for parents?
Well, I think we'll take big picture, right, which was looking at the long term, and again, even finding some signals when they kind of reanalyze the data. And I think what's exciting is this essentially adds to the mounting evidence that parent involvement in treatment is really, really important. And I think there's kind of two main things that can kind of, or that this adds to. It's the idea, one, that parents can be effectively taught the skills that us clinicians use on a regular basis with our kids in therapy, and that they can be effective members of the treatment team. So, you know, in my mind, that just means more PMIs for everybody. More parent-mediated interventions, the better. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So that was one of the two big treatment studies. Yes. The other big treatment study was a study that you guys conducted, you and your co-authors, and it was focusing on parent training and the impact on adaptive behavior. So maybe to start is, you guys talk about parent training.
Yes.
The previous one talked about parent-mediated intervention. What's the difference?
Yes. So this is my tomato.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
So both labels, and I'll call them labels for treatments, are designating interventions where the parent is the agent of change. They're the ones that are taught the skills to work with their child and improve skills or reduce challenging or maladaptive behaviors. Parent training, that particular label has a history in kind of general child mental health to identify treatments for typically developing children that have disruptive behavior. It has over 40 years of research on this parent training for disruptive behaviors. I think what's been happening is that label, understandably, maybe it's not the best way to describe what's happening, like training parents. And so these new labels have come out that I think do a better job of capturing really what's happening in the context of these treatments, that the parent really is the mediator of the treatment. They're the ones that are implementing the treatment. And so what we're actually seeing now is this kind of burst in new labels that reflect this. So you see parent-mediated intervention, parent education, caregiver-mediated interventions, parent-implemented interventions. But it's really kind of a tomato in terms of they're all really labels designating interventions where the parent is the primary interventionist, I guess.
Gotcha. Okay, that was spoken like
No.
a scientist. It's great. And then, so you guys focus on adaptive behavior,
Yes.
where the previous study was focusing on social communication.
Yes.
Just tell us a little bit about that and why that. Why
Adaptive behavior.
Yeah, why adaptive behavior?
Well, I'll start with what adaptive behavior is.
That'd be great. That'd be good. Start with that. Right.
So adaptive behavior is essentially what an individual can do independently on a daily basis. And so it's really a distinction between what a child can do technically, versus what they actually do on a regular and daily basis. And so for us, it may be that a child can get dressed or may be able to get themselves dressed, but if they're not actually doing it on a daily basis, then we would say that they're not exhibiting that adaptive skill or behavior. So my colleagues and I, we're very interested in adaptive behavior because we believe, well, my main area of interest is disruptive behavior or challenging behaviors. But my colleagues and I feel that there's a very strong link between disruptive behaviors and adaptive skills. And it kind of goes back to that, what you can do versus what you do. So we know lots of our kids know how to get dressed. They know how to, brush their teeth. They know how to use utensils when eating, but they may refuse to do so. And if they refuse to do so, then they're going to come out lower on a measure of adaptive skills because they're not doing what they're capable of doing. So our hypothesis has been for a very long time that if you can reduce challenging behaviors, defiance, non-compliance around daily living skills, you open the door to improving those daily living skills or reintroducing them, and for children who may have previously protested or refused to do them. Yes.
Awesome. So what did you guys do in your study? Tell us about your study.
So the study really was focused primarily on using a parent training or parent-mediated intervention to reduce disruptive behaviors in kids with ASD, and comparing that behavioral parent training intervention to kind of general parent psychoeducation, so kind of Autism 101. And we were looking to see if the parent training program did a better job in reducing problem behavior so that we could see then if there was that reduction in problem behavior resulted in an improvement in adaptive skills or daily living skills. Yes.
Gotcha. And the intervention you guys are doing, is
Yes.
there a name for that particular intervention?
The Ruby program.
Gotcha.
RUBI. Ruby.
RUBI, right. And so yeah, just tell us a little more about that and what's the background there.
Yeah, so the program, in terms of adaptive skills, the big study was that the program worked really well to reduce disruptive behaviors. This particular paper was looking at, again, how it worked, how the program works with adaptive skills, and what's really cool is it worked. It worked beautifully, actually. Awesome. We found that for kids whose family participated in the Ruby intervention, the behavioral parent training intervention, that they saw significant reductions in disruptive behavior, but also saw significant improvements in adaptive skills or daily living skills, which is something that didn't happen in our control group. They flatlined in terms of the no change in adaptive skills over time, whereas the intervention group made significant improvement. So it's essentially evidence that it's evidence to support this link between disruptive behavior and adaptive skills, and is a signal that if you can improve or reduce disruptive behavior, that opens the door to improving adaptive skills.
Now, so I'll just highlight and make a couple quick plugs that sort of this Ruby model that you developed with your colleagues is now sort of here in Seattle now that you've moved yourself here. Yes. And so this is a service that families can avail themselves at the Seattle Children's Autism Center. So I'll highlight that. And the other thing I would highlight is that, and maybe this is correct with you, Jim, that Dr. Bears will be joining us at Autism 200 in April of this year. So that's April 20th. April 20th, you'll be here to talk more about all of this research and the Ruby model and parent-mediated training, parent-mediated interventions, whatever word that is. We'll hear about that on April 20th.
Yes.
Yes, that's great. Well, and might you be here for a few minutes after in case folks have questions?
Yep.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit and focus a little bit on autism in the media. Last year, there were several books that gained a lot of attention last year, though they were released at the end of 2015. Neurotribes by Steve Silverman and Uniquely Human by Barry Prezant both provided interesting glimpses into both the history of autism spectrum disorder and really thinking about or rethinking some of the culture of autism. More locally, there was a book that came out last year called Stories of Autism, Awareness, Acceptance, Inclusion by local photographer Charles Cotugno. Coutinho. I apologize, Charles. So that's a beautiful book, photographs of individuals with autism. And then this year, the BBC released The A Word, which is a 6-part series about a family that slowly comes to the realization that their 5-year-old has autism. A Word will be back this year for season 2. And something that our data scientists at the University of Washington have been watching very closely this year, after an extremely long run, Minecraft had been the #1 interest for school-age children with autism, but finally ousted last year. Who knows? Pokemon Go. Very nice. Pokemon Go is now the #1 interest for children with autism. Interestingly, does not differ from the non-autism group.
Rah, 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 rah.
Right?
That's great. Excellent. Last quick point I'm going to make about science, and then I'll stop droning on about science. A couple things we want to be thinking about and looking forward to in 2017. The first is there's a handful of studies that this past year that really focused on the connections between autism, obesity, and diabetes. And there's a handful of studies that are all very preliminary, but I think indicate where there's going to be a lot of research going in the next year. And some of those findings focused on increased rates of obesity in children with autism. And there's a number of reasons to account for that. One would be as a result of side effects for some of the medications that may be used for addressing some of the challenging behaviors we see in autism. Another is some of the reduced opportunities for exercise and physical activity that we see for our children with autism, which tend to actually exacerbate at the end of the school as kids transition out of school. And then the third is some of the connections that have been seen between some of these genetic events or that are related to autism are also associated with obesity themselves. So a number of sort of potential converging etiologies for both obesity and autism. So a couple other findings related, again, these are all a series of different papers that all came together over 2016, which is sort of, we look at it, we think, we might be going further into this in 2017. A couple other findings were, as we were talking about risk factors earlier, another risk factor that was published this year was that parents who have diabetes while pregnant they have increased risk for having a child with autism. As well as mothers who are obese during the time of pregnancy are increased risk for having a child with autism. So those are a couple other findings, potentially looking at a link there. More needs to be done. These are preliminary findings, but I think we're going to see a lot of research looking at that in 2017. And finally, I would say, looking at maybe not 2017, but 2018, I think we're going to see a real focus on precision medicine and autism. We're kind of on the cusp. In 2017, we're going to see a handful more small trials looking at individuals who have common biological etiologies and particular treatments targeted towards those. And in 2018, I think we'll start to see even more of those being published. So I think that's sort of just a preview of what I think we're going to see a little more of in 2017 in terms of what science will be talking about this time next year.
So by precision medicine, you mean more specific, like more specific groups?
I mean medicine that is applied, or treatments that are applied to individuals that are targeted. That this particular intervention we're going to use for this particular individual for a particular reason that we are identified. In this case, it could be biologically driven. That's what where we're at now.
Right. Well, that would make a big difference.
I think so.
Yep. So, finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the change in administration that is happening tomorrow. Lots of concerns. Many people are concerned about what to expect, and I think the bottom line is we just don't know. And we really just kind of it's going to be a wait and see what happens type of approach. This is a leader who, has said something and then kind of turned around and said, something opposite, or said, well, I never said that. Misleading people, outright lies, about certain things. So, what do we do? How do we know what to expect? And I think that we're going to talk, what we can really start with is to take a look at the history of some of his nominees for cabinet members, for example. So, you know, there are reasons in our special education community to pay close attention to the Attorney General nominee. Jeff Sessions in 2000 as a senator argued when they were you know, kind of talking more about IDEA. He argued against inclusion and suggested that children with disabilities should have more discipline, and we're getting away with their behavior, and we're causing lots and lots of disruptions in the school. He didn't differentiate at all when he came up with example after example of these letters and these stories that he heard from teachers and other professionals at school. He never differentiated between children whose behavior was a result of their disability versus behavior for possibly other reasons, right? So he kind of lumped all these kids who he felt were these, you know, kind of bad kids, and kind of lumped them all together and basically said, well, you know, these children shouldn't be in our classrooms. They should be excluded. And he spent a lot of time talking about more severe discipline because stating, well, you know, there was a child, and since he was a special education student, he could not be disciplined in the normal way. So he advocated for exclusion, expulsion from general and repeated suspensions. So, you know, that's something that as a community we want to really pay attention to because, you know, that could be civil rights violation, okay?
Gotcha. The nominated Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, she had her confirmation hearings earlier this week. During those hearings, there were some concerns raised that she seemed to be unaware that the IDEA Act, the IDEA law, was a federal law, and so it's a little bit concerning that some folks had raised. What Ms. DeVos has been involved in is been a vocal proponent of voucher programs in charter schools. We anticipate that she'll continue advocating for that. Traditionally, those haven't really worked very well for families with disabilities, which is why we're sort of raising it here. Voucher programs, you know, allow a student to use public money that can be used in a private school, which ostensibly sounds good, but in practice what is happening is many students end up giving their federal rights provided by IDEA by accessing those services. As well, many of those voucher programs don't actually cover all the funds associated with a private school, so it really isn't a true opportunity for everyone. So it's a bit of a challenge. So it's unlikely that Washington State is going to be impacted too much by some of this because a lot of that's located at the state level, and that's because the Every Student Succeeds Act, which that replaces the No Child Left Behind Act, that puts those decisions regarding education really squarely in the hands of the state. So we can anticipate that our state, which has traditionally done very well in this realm, will continue to do really well supporting that. I guess sort of following up on your point about civil rights, we sort of worry about the reversing of civil rights given the incoming president's comments about eliminating the Office of Civil Rights altogether, and it's nice to have that tied strongly into the Department of Education. But with Sessions and DeVos sort of leading that, we sort of worry a little bit about that. So something for us to be watching out for. Final thing I'm just going to make a pitch in terms of news that's come up recently was the conversation between the president-elect and Robert F. Kennedy. And Robert F. Kennedy has been a particular I don't know if I say proponent. I'm just going to say this. He's sort of really been involved in the movement suggesting that vaccines may be harmful and may be contributing to autism, and definitely a vaccine skeptic. And so that's worrying and frustrating because for a long time we've made significant headway against that argument that vaccines caused autism, which has been a number of studies which clearly indicate that is not the case. And it's a bit of a drag to see that sort of come back. But I think I would just highlight that what I want to worry more about even is that if I spend my time worrying and thinking about that, it's sort of taking me away from the other issues that are going on, the bigger impacts that we could have on families, which is the potential repeal of the Affordable Care Act.
Right, and I think this administration is skilled at providing distraction. You know, they say something that kind of distracts you away from, you know, sort of the real situation. And you know, what we really ought to be talking about is, well, what happens if we repeal the Affordable Care Act, you know, which has provided health insurance to between 20 and 30 million Americans, and enables states to really expand Medicaid. It's allowed families to have access to more access to evidence-based treatments like speech therapy and occupational therapy and ABA therapy, and helps pay for needed medications. You know, what really specifically what the ACA did was it required insurers to provide access to people who had pre-existing conditions. They prevented insurers from charging people with disabilities and health concerns more for their insurance. It ended these annual and lifetime caps on insurance, which, when, you know, if you have a cap, if you're planning for ABA therapy, that you're going to reach that pretty quickly. Allowed young adults to stay on their parents' health plans until they were 26. And really said it mandated this comprehensive health package that included habilitative care, which is, you know, previously insurances were really only covering rehabilitative care. You know, and as we know, our children with autism, it's not rehabilitation, it's habilitation. We're teaching them new skills for the first time. It also mandated mental health and behavioral health services and prescription drug coverage and much, much more. So, you know, the impact of a repeal, you know, we may not feel this impact for a year or so, but a repeal without a replacement that covers these services would really have significant consequences for people with disabilities and their families in the coming years. So, you know, we're going to be watching these, we're going to be covering these stories and more all year long. Take a look at us on our autism blogcast. We've been talking about this already, and we're going to continue to talk about it. And really what we suggest is that this is the time to really pay close attention. Speak your mind, you know, contact your legislatures. You know, this is not the time to kind of stay silent and hope for the best. You know, we encourage you to stay engaged, we encourage you to get involved, and we encourage you to make your voice heard, okay? So we have about 15 minutes, so thank you for paying attention. We're going to be able to take some questions, you know, and all of our great interviewees are sticking around. So if you've got questions specifically for them, we're happy to hear it.
Yeah, thank you.
And we just want to acknowledge these guys. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, thank you all for listening to Jim and I and letting us pretend that we're news reporters every year and every month. And thanks to the team that helps us out regularly. Thanks to the team involved in Autism 200. And thank you to our wonderful guests. Any questions for our wonderful guests or for Jim and I? We're happy to answer. Yes, a whole handful of questions. Let me start in that back corner here.
So, what do you see as the future of employment for autism in 2017, seeing as there have been trends in companies hiring autistics and having pilot programs with initiatives? Do you think that will grow in 2017 and more companies will take note? And what can parents and educators do as our kids are aging up through the school system to be ready for employment in the future?
That's a great question. I'm happy to answer, but I think also, are you passing to Gary?
We're going to put Gary on the spot to the expert. You know, you can answer that question the best.
Great.
Hi. So Gary Stobie. Hello. Great. So I'm Gary Stobie. I direct our adult autism clinic at UW and the transition program here at Seattle Children's. And you're exactly right. We are seeing a number of businesses, and it's pretty exciting because we are, you know, at the kind of the center where we're seeing this model for inclusion starting to grow. And I think we have Microsoft to thank for that. We're seeing initiatives at Amazon. Our leaders in the community, I think, are on the list of kind of doing the best jobs of advancing it. There's a lot of progress that needs to be made. The employment numbers in autism are pretty dismal. Numbers in the range of kind of 10 to 20% employment rates. And this is regardless of whether or not you also have intellectual disability or the severity of autism. So even the so-called high-functioning individuals are struggling in employment more than other developmental disabilities, and this is because of the social communication deficits that exist in autism. So this is a very important, we're excited to be really on the cusp of a movement that we're seeing, again, led by Microsoft. Brad Smith, who is the president of Microsoft right now, is co-chairing the USA Special Olympic Games that are going to be here in Seattle in the summer of 2018. He has made his statement that he wants to see Seattle as the model city for inclusion. And I think that this is going to be seen in the workplace. So I think we're going to continue to see movement in that direction. On our part, University of Washington, Anna Marie Koss, our president, has just committed to supporting a employment program on Seattle UW campus. I was on a phone conference with the group yesterday, so that will be starting in collaboration with the Seattle school districts this coming fall. So hopefully we'll be able to tell you more exciting things as those things grow.
Thanks, Gary. That's great. There's a question over here I saw. Yes.
Which one?
Oh, right here. Right. Oh, sorry.
I'm Michael. Ramona, what is the paraeducator bill you talked about? And Karen, what does RUBY stand for? And how do you deal with disruptive behavior?
That one working? Try that. That one's the one that is not working.
Research units in behavioral intervention. It's another lovely, horrible name for a parenting intervention. So that's why we call it RUBY.
You'll have to come in April for that. I'm just kidding. Yes. I'm just kidding.
Do you answer now or wait till April?
Give it a quick.
Yeah, so it's a program where I or other therapists meet with the parents weekly, about 1 hour a week, for 11 sessions, short term, low intensity, where we teach them various skills and strategies they can use to help address the challenging behaviors at home, and it's based on principles of applied behavior analysis.
And the paraeducator bill, this was actually introduced, I know it was last session, it might be the third session back, but it basically looking for training and a career path for paraeducators. And I think there's consensus around the training, but the career path is the holdup. Whether or not there's a move to have paraeducators get a credential of some sort, so that basically we'd have stepping stones, and that could help build, if they wanted to become a teacher, help goes towards a teacher. And there's some resistance to actually having that credential because it involves financial and training implications for the paraeducators. So that's where the dispute seems to be. But there does seem to be a lot of consensus around solid training and support for them.
Thank you.
Oh,
A science question. Great.
Yeah, you're going on your big study on genetics, and I'm sorry my son declined to participate, but he's 28 years old.
Okay, it's no pressure.
But I have a thing. We know autism and seizures are combined, and yeah, he ticked that one. He has the seizures, but he also has a genetic heart disorder that causes abnormal physiology, and I was wondering, it happens, there's a version that happens with Down syndrome. Is there anything you find where you have other related disorders, some that come of physical consequences?
Yeah, for sure. So I think your point is salient in terms of many individuals with autism have a number of other challenges, medical conditions or other behavioral challenges.
Yeah, they're related.
And so what we've been finding is that some individuals with particular genetic events show commonalities or common patterns. So some individuals with particular genetic events have a much higher rate of seizures or have a much higher rate of other medical challenges, whether it be early heart challenges or, for example, you get gastrointestinal systems. Those are a couple of different things.
Yeah, mine is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with obstruction.
That was a good mouthful that you've got.
Oh,
really
yeah,
good at
yeah.
throwing around, yeah.
I've hung around a lot of medical places, over the past 28 years.
Right.
I've increased my vocabulary a lot.
I bet. So your point is salient in terms of we don't know exactly what all the different particular combinations are, and that's what we're trying to figure out right now. Because our advances in understanding these particular genes, this is so new. It was our first paper we started thinking about this was in 2007, where we identified some of these structural changes, and it was just 2010 when we were actually first able to look at the whole genome and say, great. Or I should say the whole. We're still working on the whole genome, the whole exome, and say where are all those gene coding regions? Boom, what are the particular genes involved? So it's so new. So I think we'll be able to have better answers for you even as we go on. But that's exactly what we're finding.
I have a science question.
Oh no, not from Jen.
It's not about if the twins had different moms.
Okay, great. Thank
this
you.
time.
Okay.
So I have a question. Like on slide 5, when you were going through, so that it's CDH2.
CHD2.
Okay, so is there any other disorders that they find where that gene may also have a protein deficiency, like maybe similar things that you might get a dual diagnosis of autism and schizophrenia, or autism, Tourette's? Do they find that in just the other single diagnosis? So if there's someone with Tourette's, would they also have a protein deficiency on the same gene?
Right. So good question. So let me see if I can sort of tackle that. So an individual, for some gene events that we've identified associated with autism, we have a very clear-cut finding where if that gene is not creating the protein it's creating, then we see autism. That's not true for all genetic events we find. There's a handful that we've been able to say clearly, boom, if there's a disruption, we can count on seeing autism. But for other gene events, there's a much broader array of challenges that emerge, right? So we might see an individual who has, for example, a disruption at 16p11.2. It's a particular region on chromosome 16. That's the single most common contributor to autism, counts for about 1% of all cases with autism. But if you have a disruption at 16p11.2, you have about 25% chance of having autism. You have about 55% chance of having a speech sound disorder, and an array of other challenges, other frequencies. So there's an array of challenges that we associate with that particular event. So it could be CHD2 is actually one of those genes where we know a little bit less about. We've only so far found it in individuals who have autism, so we don't know yet. We haven't seen enough folks yet with it to be able to say, is this only an autism gene? But it's entirely possible we could find someone who has, a challenge, whatever it may be, schizophrenia over here with 16p11.2, and we could also find someone with autism 16p11.2. There's a disruption to that region, or in a specific gene case, disruption to that gene, but we don't know yet about expression levels for that particular given gene. So when you're talking about sort of disruption of that protein, you could have a disruption. This is getting probably more technical than anyone cares about. I apologize. I'm going to wrap it up real fast for you, Jen. So you could imagine you have a specific gene that's disrupted to varying degrees, right? So it might be expressed at differing levels because of it might not be disrupted in all your cells, for example, and you might have a different outcome associated with that. But we just don't know enough yet. I was a real long answer saying, we're not really sure.
Yeah. Thank you for nothing.
Hello. As a father of the child at autism, but also a child care provider at home, I have a question. And is there a way to support those providers who take care of children that may see something that they can raise it up and get help from? For instance, this class is so helpful, and if you can provide it, let's say an hour in a star credit for those teachers and providers, would encourage more parents, more teachers, more providers to take the class and understand, and maybe expand their knowledge and helpful hints to other parents and kids. So it may not be a question, but I wonder, is there something out there or something that you can do to support those parents and providers?
That is an awesome pitch for providing more opportunities for training and education, which we would love to do. You're in, 100%. So I guess I would just pitch a couple things. So there are different ways to access information about autism. Certainly the Autism 200, as you mentioned, is an opportunity, and it's always available, and we would love to have this be more available for folks. Everything we do is recorded, so folks can watch everything that's been done for the past few years. So that becomes, there's a rich archival history of all the really good speakers, and then there's the handful of Jim and I goofing around in the January editions. But there's some real opportunities there. The University of Washington, we've had a certificate program that's aired past couple years, which is really geared towards providers. Things get pricey, and that's becomes a challenge. How do we provide this in a more financially feasible way for providers? So don't have a good answer for that yet. Everything we do here is all volunteer. All our guests willingly leave their homes for the evening and hang out with us. So yeah.
And I think that as a child care provider, you have a child care at your home, right? That you have other kids come in. Do you need to go and receive credit for continuing education, or is that something that you need to do as a provider? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the University of Washington used to, I think, have a, go out and we'd go and do trainings for people who were providing care for, they were basically, respite care for, and lots of times it was family members who got paid to provide care for other, their family members with a disability. I'm not sure if that program is maintained, at this point through the University of Washington Autism Center. It was something. It'd be worthwhile just kind of calling the University of Washington's Autism Center and looking and talking to their training director and seeing if there were opportunities for people like you to go and get those credits so that they can earn. And as I'll just kind of echo what Raphe said, this is something. We're hoping to do more. For example, we're going to be doing a training for interpreters that also need to get these types of credits so that they know more about autism. They have the language of autism. And this is the final thing that I would say, as a child care provider, and you see some children, and you might have some concerns about them. And sometimes it's hard to know, well, how do I tell this parent that I'm worried about their kids, And sometimes, the parents do have the shoot the messenger type of mentality where, how dare you tell me that? But, it is probably in the best interest of the child for you to express your concerns and say, you don't have to say, I'm worried they have autism, but you could say, well, I'm worried they're not talking as much, or I'm worried they're not playing with the kids as much as other kids. Have you talked to your doctor about some of these things? So did you have something to add to that?
For the parents to Child Find, Child Find Washington, and that they can start getting evaluated there. My son was in a child care situation for years, and they had concerns, and they never did bring it to our attention because they didn't know how to bring it up to us. And it was a daycare provider that saw him like twice a year, an alternate provider that, after seeing him for one day, brought it to our attention, and we did feel kind of like shoot the messenger. We were offended, but thank God she did, because we got him evaluated and started treatment.
So, maybe our training could help, child care providers be able to have that conversation. That would be something that we'd be able to address. Yeah. I'm going to just take a break and see if there are anybody at our remote sites that are tuning in, and anybody has a question in Methow Valley or up in Everett or wherever you're watching tonight. Let's give them a second to ask if they do. So, do we have one more question, or is everybody ready to go? No.
I think we're good to go.
We're good to go. Well, thank you guys
Thanks,
for
everyone.
putting up with us and our shenanigans, and hope to see a lot of you next month where and we're talking about genetics next month. It's going to be great. Very exciting.